Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Jason Kawal. I'm the director of the Lampert Institute for Civic and Global Affairs. And it's a great pleasure to be introducing our speaker this afternoon. And it's a special day. It's our last talk in our Lampert series on human rights. So it's a culminating event, really. It sums up everything. And of course, I assume that you all also think, as I do, that when you have a culminating event, you want a philosopher. So it's a joy. Actually, it is a joy to be introducing John Corvino, professor of philosophy at Wayne State University in Detroit. Professor Corvino received his BA from St. John's University and his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, both in philosophy. Professor Corvino is perhaps most recognized for his extensive work addressing issues concerning the morality of homosexuality broadly construed. For several years, he wrote a column, The Gay Moralist, that appeared online in a variety of venues. I think for myself and for many others, it was some of these columns where we first became aware of his work. And his work there, as elsewhere, stands out for being exceptionally clear, thoughtful, and with a healthy dose of humor. He's the co-author or author of several books, including Debating Same-Sex Marriage with Maggie Gallagher, What's Wrong with Homosexuality, and most recently, Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination, which he co-authored with Ryan Anderson and Sharif Girgis. Now, I'd like to draw attention to two features of Professor Corvino's work that I think are maybe especially notable. So first, he's done an exceptional job of reaching out to a broader audience through his columns, many speaking engagements and debates, and some really exceptional YouTube videos. If you haven't seen them, Google them. But they really are a striking example of public philosophy at its best, clear, well-argued, and again, often hilarious. But at the same time on topics of tremendous social and political importance, and a great deal of personal importance to a lot of, to many people. And I should perhaps mention, too, that at the same time that he's been engaging in such public-facing work, he's also been publishing more strictly academic papers in some of the very best journals in philosophy. He has a book with Oxford University Press, the most prestigious press for our discipline. So it's a pretty impressive body of work. And the other aspect of his work that I wanted to touch on was just the care and generosity with which he engages with the views of his opponents. And this is a theme which recurs across reviews of his books and in speaking about him, that Professor Corvino truly engages with the arguments, the genuine arguments of his opponents. And I think this has also been true of his co-authors, but I think in some ways Professor Corvino helps to bring out these sorts of thoughtful, reflective engagements on potentially quite difficult issues where positions and feelings are often very deeply held. Professor Corvino's work, I think, really can serve as a much-needed model for thoughtful engagement and debate, particularly in times of striking polarization and often shallow public discourse. So, we're extremely happy to have him here today as he presents his paper on God's authority, religious liberty in a marriage equality world. So, please join me in welcoming John Corvino.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction and that warm welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. The title of my talk today, On God's Authority, comes from the case of Kentucky clerk Kim Davis. Some of you may remember her. In 2015, after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage across the nation, she refused to issue any more marriage licenses from her office or to allow her deputy clerks to do so. And when she was asked, on what grounds do you refuse these licenses, on whose authority, she answered, on God's authority. Now, a judge ordered Davis to... Sorry, I'm going to try to lower this microphone a little bit while I'm talking. Use knob to control volume. That should be easy. Great. A judge ordered... Do you still have me? Yeah, okay, good. A judge ordered Davis to issue the licenses or step down from her job. She refused to do so and was held in contempt of court, went to jail for 5 days. When she was eventually let out, she was praised as a religious martyr by some, including Mike Huckabee, who you can see over on the left of the screen there. Others said, look, Davis is an elected official. Her job is to represent everybody. And particularly, her job is to determine whether people meet the legal requirements for a license, not sort of divine requirements for a license. She's administering a legal matter, not a sacrament. Partly because of her position as an elected official, and partly because of her very specific kind of job, there are some ways in which her case is not that difficult in my view. So what I want to do today, given our limited time, is to focus on a more recent case, actually in some sense more recent, in some sense older, but what I think is a more challenging and interesting case, and it's the case of Masterpiece Cake Shop. How many of you have heard a little bit about this case in the news? It's currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. Sometime in June, the court is likely to be issuing its decision. It originated actually back in 2012. A gay couple, Charlie Craig and David Mullins, entered Masterpiece Cake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado. Sat down, started looking through a catalog of cakes. The owner of the shop, Baker Jack Phillips, comes over to them and says, how can I help you? They said, we are looking to buy a cake for our wedding celebration. Phillips said, I am so sorry. My religious beliefs are opposed to that. I do not believe in same-sex marriage. I cannot sell you a cake for your wedding. Happy to sell you other things in the store, birthday cakes, cookies, things like that, but a cake for a wedding, I cannot do that. Couple left the shop, filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Division, which found the baker liable for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, which is prohibited in the state of Colorado. Colorado courts have agreed with the commission's decision, and that has now been appealed to the Supreme Court. Now, there are two important differences between this case and the case of Kim Davis that I want you to notice right off the bat. One is that Jack Phillips, unlike Kim Davis, is a private business owner. He's not working in his capacity as an elected official, but as a private business owner who is not sort of tasked with representing the entire public in his work in any normal way of understanding those terms. The other is this. This case arose not because of any change in marriage law, but because of anti-discrimination law. Why? Well, 2012, marriage was not yet legal in the state of Colorado. The couple was actually getting married in the state of Massachusetts, where it was legal, and then coming back to Colorado to celebrate. And a lot of people, in thinking about these conflicts that are emerging right now, point to the Obergefell decision in 2015 and saying, as a result of that decision, we have all of these conflicts. Well, guess what? This conflict was from before Obergefell because it was about discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, not about marriage law per se. Something to keep in mind as we think about the cases. Now, in order to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm going to give you a couple more cases, which we'll have in the background as we discuss these issues. Very shortly after the Colorado Civil Rights Division issued its decision in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, a man named William Jack walked into Azucar Bakery in Denver, Colorado, asked the baker, Marjorie Silva, whom he knew to be liberal, progressive, said, look, here's what I want. I want a Bible-shaped cake, and on one side I want you to draw me the image of two men with a red X through it, and on the other side I want Leviticus 18:22, homosexuality is a detestable sin. Leviticus 18:22 is man shall not lie with man as with woman, is an abomination unto God. That's a lot to write on a cake. He paraphrased. It's a paraphrase. Homosexuality is a detestable sin. Leviticus 18:22. The baker, Marjorie Silva, said, I'm so sorry, that conflicts with my beliefs. I will not write that discriminatory message on a cake. I will not give you that design. Here's what I'll do. I'll sell you a Bible-shaped cake. I'll even give you an icing bag. You can write whatever you want. But writing that's too much for me. The customer goes and then files a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Division, which presumably was his point all along. People usually don't buy homosexuality as a detestable sin cakes. That's not really a thing that people do. But he was trying to make a point. He charges Silva with discrimination on the basis of religion because she would not write a particular verse for him. And the commission said, no, she is not guilty of discrimination on the basis of religion. She is simply refusing to promote a particular message, at which point the customer said, whoa, wait a second. If Jack Phillips can't refuse to support same-sex, if he can't express his disapproval of same-sex relationships, why is it okay for Marjorie Silva to refuse to express her... I'm going to start that sentence again because I've already screwed it up. If it's not against the law for Marjorie Silva to refuse to express disapproval of same-sex relationships, why is it against the law for Jack Phillips to refuse to express approval of same-sex relationships? It seems like these cases are the mirror image of each other. The only difference in the customer's mind is in one case you have a baker who approves of such relationships, in another case you have a baker who disapproves, but both bakers are simply trying to express their values in the operation of their work. And it seemed, at least to this customer, that the commission was being inconsistent. And right now, as this case, the Masterpiece case, is before the Supreme Court, many people have raised this question of, well, what about the Zukar Bakery case, and isn't the commission being inconsistent in its views? Let's mix things up even more. I'm going to give you one more case. Take the cake bakery in Toledo, Ohio. Customer comes in, this was in, I think, 2016, orders a birthday cake. Not a wedding cake, a birthday cake. Customer leaves the store. After the customer leaves the store, the baker, LaGresha Pfizer Brown, goes on the customer's Facebook page, notices that the customer is in a same-sex relationship and that the cake is actually for the birthday of the customer's lesbian partner, sends the customer the following text: Candace, I'm sorry, I just realized you're in a same-sex relationship and we do not do cakes for same-sex weddings or parties. I'm so sorry. I wasn't aware of this exactly until I saw your page. Take care, smiley face. This is apparently a screenshot from the customer's phone. It was the picture was released in the news during discussion of this particular case. My own view, and this is a very personal thing, anyone who uses this font for text deserves to lose in court, but that's just me. But this actually never went to court. It was never litigated, so we don't know a whole lot about the case beyond what came out in the initial news reports. Now, you might say, well, this is different, right? This is, I mean, it's one thing for a person to, not want to express their approval or disapproval for marriage, but this is just, a birthday. It's a birthday cake. And also, Facebook page, who does that? It's like, hi, I'd like to buy a blueberry muffin. Great, first we're going to audit your Instagram. I mean, we don't do that, all right? But one could imagine the baker, LaGresha Pfizer Brown, saying something very similar to what Jack Phillips was saying by, look, when a person gives somebody a birthday cake in the context of a relationship, what is that? It's an act of affection. It's an act of love. But I, as a baker, don't want to participate in that act of love. It conflicts with my religious beliefs because I'm against lesbian affection. This is in the context of a lesbian relationship. I don't want to be complicit in that. Therefore, I don't want to bake the cake. That's my rights to freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So one of the things I want to do today is to give you some principles and distinctions with which to think about these cases and maybe compare and contrast them. And generally speaking, the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about anti-discrimination law and the First Amendment, which seem to come in tension in these cases, then religious liberty, then free speech, then discrimination, and I'm going to conclude by talking about some of the changes in the landscape over recent years and how that's affecting the culture wars more generally. So, starting with anti-discrimination law and the First Amendment. The first two cases I described, Masterpiece Cake Shop and Zukar Bakery, both took place in Colorado. Colorado's public accommodations law says that a place of public accommodation cannot refuse, withhold from, or deny to an individual the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations on the basis of race, color, disability, sex, sexual orientation, national origin or ancestry, creed, and marital status. Masterpiece Cake Shop, we've been emphasizing that it says full and equal enjoyment, and clearly these customers have not been getting the full and equal enjoyment of the bakery services. And the fact that it prohibits refusals on the basis of sexual orientation, as well as marital status, which might also be relevant in a case like this, but sexual orientation is the one emphasized in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. Now you might think, looking at the law, that it's a pretty easy case, right? Clearly, the customers did not get the full and equal enjoyment of the bakery services, and the bakery is prohibited from denying that on the basis of sexual orientation. But in fact, it's complicated for two reasons. One is that Colorado law, like any state's laws, need to be consistent with the U.S. Constitution. And as we'll see in a moment, people argue that the Constitution's guarantees of freedom of religion and freedom of speech protect the baker in this case. The other is the idea that the baker is not, in fact, discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. He is merely refusing on the basis of a particular view about marriage, and if a heterosexual person were to come into the store and try to buy a cake for a same-sex wedding, he would refuse all the same, whereas if a gay person came into the store and wanted to buy a cake for their friend's heterosexual wedding, he'd be perfectly okay with that. So he's not, he says, discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation. He's refusing on some other basis. So we're going to talk about both of those things. But first, the First Amendment of the Constitution. You are no doubt aware, but I will repeat it for you. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Two aspects of the First Amendment that are emphasized in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. One, free exercise of religion, and two, freedom of speech. And in the next two parts of the talk, I will talk about each of those. Free exercise of religion and freedom of speech. Let's start with free exercise of religion, or as we sometimes refer to it, religious liberty. The free exercise argument in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case has not gotten a lot of traction in court. I say this also acknowledging that Justice Kennedy, who's considered an important vote in this case, does seem to be interested in that particular line of argument. At least he seemed to be interested in it during the oral argument. But the main reason I think that, generally speaking, it has not gotten a lot of traction in this case is because the court before has considered cases where you have laws that are not aimed at a particular religious group. It's not like a law that says, you know, if you're Jewish, you cannot be an elected official in this town, or a law that says, you know, you can't practice a particular kind of religious ritual, or you can't wear a particular kind of religious symbol. A neutral law aimed at the general good, which only incidentally affects religious practice. And the court has a number of times considered cases with those kinds of laws. And in each case, the court has said, the Supreme Court has said, that's not an unconstitutional violation of your religious liberty. One of the most famous cases was the Reynolds case having to do with polygamy in 1878. George Reynolds believed, as a matter of his fundamentalist Mormon beliefs, actually, I don't know if he would have been called a fundamentalist Mormon in 1878. At that time, he was just a Mormon. He believed that he was supposed to take multiple wives, and he tried to do that. And the court said no. And the Supreme Court, it was Justice Morrison, or Chief Justice Morrison, said, "Can a man excuse his illegal practices because of his religious belief? To permit this would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land, and in effect to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself." Think about this. We have lots of laws that press up against certain people's desired religious practices. The Aztecs used to practice religion by ripping people's hearts out in ritual sacrifice. Do not try this today. Why? We have laws against murder. And you can't say, well, yes, you have laws against murder, but I'm an Aztec, I want to rip people's hearts out. No. Because again, this is not a law that's aimed at undermining the Aztec religion. It's a law aimed at protecting general good. You could say the same thing about anti-discrimination laws. This famous quotation from the Reynolds case was brought up in a much later case, back in 1990, Employment Division versus Smith. There, the court was considering a Native American who wanted to use peyote as part of his ritual Native American practices. He was tested for drugs at his place of employment and tested positive for mescaline. Peyote is an hallucinogen related to mescaline. Lost his job, applied for unemployment benefits in the state of Oregon. Oregon said, sorry, you lost your job for cause, you don't get unemployment benefits. He said, but wait, this was my religious practice. Appealed it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said no, and in an opinion written by that great enemy of religious liberty, Justice Antonin Scalia, the court said, to permit you to do this would be to permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. Scalia quoted the Reynolds decision. Scalia is not going to be deciding the Masterpiece decision because he is no longer with us. But if he were, he would have to contend with the fact that, at least as a matter of religious exercise, the court has generally said that neutral laws aimed at the common good do not violate the Free Exercise Clause. And so many conservatives have instead been emphasizing the free speech aspect of the case, which brings me to the next section. Jack Phillips, the baker in the Masterpiece case, has certain beliefs about marriage. He wants to express those beliefs. He does not want to express views about marriage with which he disagrees. And in this way, you could compare him with Marjorie Silva in Azucar Bakery. She does not want to express disapproval of same-sex relationships. He does not want to express approval of same-sex relationships. Aren't these cases just mirror images of each other? And I want to say, no, they're not exactly. Because there's an important difference in the cases. Remember what Marjorie Silva told the customer, William Jack. She said, I will sell you a Bible-shaped cake. I'll even give you an icing bag so you can write whatever you want on it. What you do with the cake after you leave the store is literally none of my business. I will not sell a particular design to you. Jack Phillips, by contrast, never discussed designs with his customers. He said, I will not sell you any cake for a same-sex wedding. He would not sell the customers the very same items that he was also willing to sell to other customers. That's an important difference between the cases. One way to explain this difference is by referring to design-based refusals versus use-based refusals. Let me give you a few more examples. Jack Phillips has pointed out that it isn't just gay wedding cakes that he will not do. There are other kinds of cakes he will not do. And actually, first let me say, when he talks about gay wedding cakes, a gay wedding cake is not a thing. I mean, wedding cakes have no sexual orientation. Gay people order their cakes from the same catalogs as other people. Same choices for icing, filling, size, shape, and so on. So, not a particular design. It's cakes. But he says there are other cakes he will not do. He will not do Halloween cakes because he thinks Halloween involves like demonic kinds of forces or something like that. He would not do, somebody wanted to do a cake celebrating their divorce. They wanted like a wedding cake split in half. He would not do that design. And he says, this is just one more thing I won't do, except that those examples all have to do with particular designs or themes. They're not examples of refusing to sell some people the very same cakes you refuse to sell other people. Let's take it away from cakes for a second. Suppose I own a fabric shop and I make beautiful silkscreen fabrics. It would be one thing if you came in to me and said, hey, I want this particular design on the fabric, and I said, no, that's obscene, I'm not going to do that particular design for you. It would be another thing if I sold a particular design, but I refused to sell it to you because you were a Muslim who wanted to make it into a hijab or a veil, or you were a Jewish person who wanted to make it into a yarmulke. Use-based refusal as opposed to a design-based refusal. So I think that the commission in Colorado was not being inconsistent when they said that Jack Phillips was discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation, but Marjorie Silva in the Azucar Bakery case, the Bible-shaped cake case, was not discriminating on the basis of religion. But there's another way you could take this argument. And, in fact, Phillips supporters have frequently made the argument in the following way. They said, look, even putting aside the free speech aspects of the case, Phillips is not refusing on the basis of the fact that his customers were gay, because he is happy to sell gay customers all kinds of things. He even told them, I'll sell you birthday cakes, cookies, cupcakes, and so on. What I will not do is sell you a cake for your wedding. Colorado's anti-discrimination law says that you cannot withhold services on the basis of sexual orientation, but in their view, he is not refusing because of the customer's sexual orientation. And they contrast this with cases like the Toledo case, where she said, look, I'm not going to sell you a birthday cake. So what I want to argue right now is that this is a distinction without a difference. For a few reasons. One is that the birthday cake case doesn't necessarily have to be characterized as refusing to do business with people on the basis of their sexual orientation. Because the baker could say, and again this case wasn't litigated so we don't know a lot, but the baker could very easily say something like the following, look, I'll sell gay people all kinds of things. I'll even sell them birthday cakes. The problem here was that this customer wanted to give this as a gift to her lesbian partner. She wanted to express her affection by giving this gift. I don't want to participate in that because it's lesbian and I don't approve of that. But that doesn't mean I won't deal with people who are gay. And you might say, now come on, wait a second. I mean, look what she says. She says, I just realized yours misspelled, in a same-sex relationship, and we do not do cakes for same-sex weddings or parties. She saw this as not just dealing with a gay customer, but as somehow being involved in something, a same-sex party, that she did not want to be involved in. Similar to what Jack Phillips is saying. But the other point, and this is the more important point, is that sometimes refusing to sell something for a particular use is tantamount to refusing to sell it to a particular user because the user and the use, the identities are so closely connected. And if that's the case, then you could run afoul of anti-discrimination law. So, go back to the example that I gave you earlier, the fabric shop. I say, look, I'm not going to sell you fabric to use to wear as a hijab or as a yarmulke, but I'm not discriminating against you on the basis of your religion. It's a use-based refusal, not a user-based refusal. And you're going to say to me, let me use a technical philosophical term here, bullshit. This is a case where the intended use is closely connected with the person's religious identity. Or if I may again borrow from Justice Scalia, a tax on wearing yarmulkes is a tax on Jews. Now wait a second, not all Jewish men wear yarmulkes, not only Jewish men wear yarmulkes. If I go into a synagogue, I'll put a yarmulke on as a sign of respect. But that particular activity, wearing a yarmulke, is so closely identified with the status of being Jewish that to discriminate on the basis of that use, that activity, is to discriminate on the basis of the protected status of religion. there are going to be times where it is difficult to say whether a particular intended use closely implicates a protected status. This case is not one of those times. What are we talking about when we're talking about sexual orientation? We're talking about the kinds of relationships people have or desire to have. Sexual orientation is a relational property. It's about relationships, either actual or desired. To discriminate on the basis of people's same-sex relationships is to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, which is what Jack Phillips did. So, to sum up, Marjorie Silva in the Bible-shaped case, her refusal was design-based, whereas Jack Phillips' refusal was use-based, and his refusal was one of those cases where use-based was closely connected with user-based because the use is so directly connected to the protected trait. Let me conclude and then open things up for questions and discussion. I rushed through a little bit because I wanted to have lots of time for questions and discussion, and now we have plenty of time, so that's a good thing. Okay. As I mentioned at the outset, many of these cases are emerging not simply because of marriage law changing, but also because increasingly sexual orientation is included as a protected status in anti-discrimination law. I put up Colorado's anti-discrimination law because two of the cases I was discussing were from Colorado. And Colorado's is typical, but it's not typical in the following sense. It's not typical because it includes sexual orientation, and in fact, only about half the states have sexual orientation as a protected class. Many states do not. The state of Michigan, where I live, does not. The state of Kentucky, where Kim Davis lives, does not, although certain cities like Lexington within Kentucky do. And so whether discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is prohibited will depend a lot on where you live. Nevertheless, the increasing visibility of same-sex marriage is a big part of why these kinds of cases have become a flashpoint in the culture war. And I think it's worth noticing just how substantially and rapidly attitudes about same-sex marriage have changed. I started speaking on these issues back in 1992. At that time, Gallup wasn't even polling yet on same-sex marriage. It wasn't until 1997 that they first did a poll asking Americans how they felt about same-sex marriage, and at that time, in 1997, 68% of Americans disapproved of same-sex marriage. Only 27% approved. It wasn't until 2011 that for the first time you had a majority of Americans approving of same-sex marriage. And today, or the most recent poll was last spring in 2017, you have 64% approving, 34% disapproving. That's almost flipped from where it was in 1997 when they started polling. In 20 years, which, when you're only 20 years old or so, seems like a long time because it's your entire lifetime. But in terms of social trends, not a very long time. If you look at comparable trends with regard to attitudes about race, took much longer on things like interracial marriage. If you look at things like abortion, very, very different kinds of polls. So here we have a case where things changed dramatically and relatively rapidly. But even that doesn't quite capture how rapid and unsettling this change was for many people. Because in 2004, here we see a map of all of the states that allowed same-sex marriage, colored in red. All of the states being Massachusetts. So 14 years ago, there was only one state that allowed same-sex marriage. Fast forward almost a decade later than that, almost a decade, 2013, you still only have a handful of states. West Coast, some states in the Northeast, maybe not so surprising, including New York, yay New York. A couple of weird sort of Midwestern things that happen, like Minnesota. It's like Iowa. What's going on there? But but still not very many states, and then 2 years after that, bam! All of a sudden, you have people who are living in places where there's still strong disapproval of same-sex marriage, suddenly facing this as a reality, and that is unsettling for them. That is jarring for them. There's not a lot that they can do about that legally because the Supreme Court has spoken on same-sex marriage, but many of them feel like there are still ways for me to express my disapproval, and these cases we have with bakers, florists, clerks, and so on are ways of for people to say, look, the Supreme Court may say that this is a thing, but I'm not ready to say this is a thing. I'm not going to treat this as equal to other forms of marriage and relationship. So we see that kind of conflict. One last thing I want to say, and then I'll open things up for questions. You may look at these cases and think, cake, flowers, and so on. I mean, really, do we really have to make literally a federal case of all that? I mean, how important is that stuff? And it's true that the cases you hear about in the news often have to do with the wedding conflicts. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, the reason I just stated, is that people are kind of unsettled by the changes in marriage law, and this is a kind of reaction to that. Another is that marriage makes visible that which was traditionally quite closeted in many cases. I mean, if I walk into a store to buy a birthday cake, you're not necessarily going to know that I'm gay. I mean, if I order like a rainbow sprinkled Lady Gaga themed birthday cake, but normally you're not going to know that I'm gay unless you go snooping on my Facebook page, which is creepy. If I walk in to order a wedding cake and you ask me what's the bride's name, and I'm like, Mark? Then you're going to know, right? So it makes it more visible. But all of that said, I think it's important to remember that while a lot of the fancy cases in the news have to do with wedding services, the key point of anti-discrimination law is not about wedding services. It's not about cakes and flowers. It's about things like employment and housing and basic goods and services. It's about cases like a case last year in Mississippi where a couple that had been together for about 52 years, one of them was dying, and the nephew called the funeral home and said, look, my uncle is dying, can you arrange a cremation and a memorial service? They said, absolutely. A week or so passes, the person gets very close to death. He's like, it's going to be any day now. The funeral home says, absolutely. Then when the nephew and the widower who had just lost his partner of 52 years show up at the funeral home, and the funeral home realizes that this man was in a gay marriage, suddenly says, sorry, I don't serve your kind. And in Mississippi, which does not have a law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, it would seem that that's perfectly legal for him to do. And at that point now, this grieving widower had to find a funeral home, I think it was like 90 miles away, and cancel the planned memorial service. It's things like that. So when people say to you, why do you have to make such a big deal about cakes and flowers? Remind them it's not just about cakes and flowers. It's about being able to live openly and freely as we enter the public sphere. And with that, let me say thank you very much and open things for questions. Thank you.
Professor Corvino is going to field his own.
I am going to field it, yes. Yes.
Thank you very much for that talk. Just to get the ball rolling, have any of these businesses that refuse services or goods ever just put a sign up in their window saying these are the people we serve? And I mean, I'm just saying if in cases where it's been ruled legal, either it's Azikar or John Phillips, could they just say, you need not enter, please don't ask for a wedding cake.
Yeah, so here's the thing. In places where it's illegal, they can't put up a sign that says we're not going to serve you, because then they're putting up a sign that says we're intending to do something illegal, and they're going to get in trouble doing that. What I have suggested, and what I suggest in the book, is that in order to minimize these kinds of unpleasant conflicts, what they could do is something like the following. They could post on their website or in their bakery something that says, look, we follow the law and we'll sell anybody any cake, but we want everybody to know that we believe in a traditional understanding of marriage as between one man and one woman. If I'm somebody shopping for wedding cakes and I see that, and I have other options, I'm going to take advantage of those other options. I'd rather spend my money with somebody who shares my values than somebody who's going to tell me before I even walk into the store, look, what you're about to do I don't approve of. And I believe as a matter of free speech that Jack Phillips should be able to put that sign up. He should be able to say, look, I follow the law, I will sell you a wedding cake, but I want you to know I don't believe in this form of marriage. Now, there are some who would suggest that even that is problematic, because what it does is it creates this kind of chilling effect where even though he says he's going to follow the law, he essentially tells people that they're not welcome in his store. It would be like, during the civil rights era, somebody saying, yes, we have to serve blacks and whites equally, but we want you to know that we believe in segregation. What kind of atmosphere does that create for people of different races trying to go out and live their lives and enter stores? So that suggestion is some controversial, but to me it's at least a way of doing two things. One, it's a way of avoiding some of these unpleasant direct conflicts. And the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, the couple just walked out, but there are other cases where it was really quite devastating for people. You're all emotional, you're excited, you're planning a wedding, you often have your family with you. You're flipping through a catalog, you've got these beautiful cakes you're looking at, and suddenly it's like, those are not for you. That can be humiliating in that kind of. So it avoids those kind of humiliating confrontations. It also, allows people to express their beliefs and to, take their business elsewhere if they feel like their beliefs don't cohere, their values don't cohere with the other parties. Yes?
So as the kind of sphere of what we can consider to be a different identity expands, for example, I was reading an article the other week about how we can potentially even consider educational attainment and identity. How do you think that's going to interact with law-based protections for certain identities? And how do you think we're going to make social decisions about those things? How do you think religion is going to interact with those things?
It's a very interesting question. A lot of people don't realize this, but anti-discrimination law enumerates particular categories, and part of what that means is that if a category is not on the list, it may be perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of that category. So, you come in with a Colgate shirt. I love a competing team, and I say, well, I'm not going to sell you a cake because I like I'm sorry, I don't know sports. I don't believe in that. There you go. So, and that's legal because discrimination on the basis of team membership is not one of the protected classifications, and we don't think it needs to be one of the protected classifications because that's not like a real problem in society. Whereas discrimination on the basis of race, religion, sexual orientation, those are real problems. We can see both the material harms and the dignitary harms that comes from that kind of discrimination. But as you pointed out, these lists are growing, and they're growing as we become more aware of the various vectors along which people create these hierarchies and discriminate. And your question is, well, what happens at this point? Now, some places have tried to just go full force and say, like, any kind of refusal, unless it's I'm out of flour, I can't make any more cakes. But any kind of refusal of service is going to be against the law. But that also presents complications. So I don't have an answer to give a kind of neat, bright line of these categories belong, these categories don't. Part of this is going to be a local decision, although the problem there is that the places most in need of these kinds of laws, like Mississippi, are the places where legislators are least likely to pass these kinds of laws. So where do you find laws protecting people on the basis of their sexual orientation? There are places like California, New York, places where there are going to be plenty of bakers to serve you, not places like Kentucky, Mississippi, and so on. So it's a hard question. I don't know the answer. Yes?
Hey, I really enjoyed your talk. I have a question about your insights regarding the oral arguments that were delivered recently. I understood it that Phillips was arguing that he was being compelled to speak because I thought he was making a design argument, not a use-based argument, if that's accurate. What are your thoughts on that? And is that an accurate portrayal? And what are some of the technicalities that you heard in the orals?
So I haven't studied the orals carefully. I've only read parts of them, so I don't want to speak specifically. I always think it's dangerous to try to read the tea leaves from oral argument. We usually get it wrong when we try to do that. So, but look, I will say something about this argument that Phillips is making, and that Sharif Gerges, one of my counterpoint authors, has actually been making in more detail. He had a piece up in, I think it was in Public Discourse, where he talks about the free speech aspects of the case. And he says that, look, free speech law also includes protecting people who don't want to be compelled to speak, and there are a number of cases we can point to. Example, the Hurley case, where you have a St. Patrick's Day parade, and the organizers do not want to include a gay group holding a gay banner in that parade, and the Supreme Court says, I believe in a unanimous decision, says that they don't have to allow that particular group because parades have this message, and you can't compel people to speak a message that they don't want to speak, and that includes parade organizers. And I want to say that that's a very different kind of case because parades are inherently message-oriented, right? I mean, they're designed to promote a particular message, to which Phillips and Gerges and others on Phillips' side will say, but wedding cakes have a particular message too. It's, we celebrate what's about to happen, we celebrate this union, we celebrate this wedding, and Phillips doesn't want to do that. My worry is that if you take that argument to its logical conclusion, you basically eviscerate anti-discrimination law. Let's stick with cakes for a moment. You have another baker in another shop, has an interracial couple comes in, says, you know what? I am happy to serve people of all races. I'll even sell, both white couples and black couples wedding cakes. But when an interracial couple comes in, that's something I disapprove of. I do not want to be compelled to express support, approval, whatever it is, for interracial marriage. I don't want to sell you a cake. Now, you might say, well, wait a second. When the cake doesn't express the baker's approval, nobody looks at the cake and says, the baker has blessed the union. No, it expresses the couple. But Phillips is making this argument that somehow he's being forced to speak, and this would make him be forced to speak. It seems to me that would not be as compelling a free speech argument, so why is it compelling in Phillips' case? Take it even further. Now imagine a really racist baker does not believe in any kind of integration at all. An African American comes in and says, I want to buy a birthday cake. The baker says, no, I believe black lives don't matter. Birthday cakes express a celebration of your life. I don't want to celebrate your life. I'm totally against you people. I'm not going to sell you a cake. I can't be forced to speak. I don't have to speak. I don't have to sell you a cake. At this point, we are stretched the notion of free speech so far that it seems to me we're no longer protecting expression the way we were. We're enabling discrimination. And that strikes me as the very same logic as the logic of Phillips and his supporters. So I don't think he can draw that line, even though he wants to say that ultimately this is even if it's the exact same design as he sold to the heterosexual couple last week, it's really a different design because it's saying something else in a different context. My view is that once it leaves the store, it's not really Phillips' business anymore. Yes. Mhm.
And there was this one quick moment where you said there are tricky cases
Right.
in figuring out which uses are so tied to users, but this isn't one of them.
Right.
Can you give an example of a case where it is tricky to sort of decide whether a particular use is fully tied to an identity?
So in the book, Gerges and Anderson give the example of somebody who wants to buy a cake celebrating Netanyahu and his Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies, and they suggest, well, isn't that discrimination on the basis of religion because we're talking about Israel, and that case, I say, doesn't strike me as very complicated. It seems to me there's a lot of space between Netanyahu's policies and a person's identity as Jewish. But you can imagine ways of like continuing to narrow that. So go back to the Azúcar Bakery case. A person wants a cake with a particular Bible verse on it. That Bible verse is a really important Bible verse for them. It's really closely tied to their religious identity. And the baker doesn't want to write that verse on a cake. I think what I would say there is maybe that comes close to discrimination on the basis of religion. However, because it's design-based rather than use-based, I think there are ways to say, look, this is just one thing, this is just something that this baker does not provide. And generally speaking, we give business owners a wide latitude of deciding like things that they're going to sell and things that they're not going to sell, right? A vegan bakery does not have to sell real buttercream cakes. A kosher bakery does not have to sell cakes made with lard. A bakery could say, look, we don't sell cakes that say that to anybody. And even if you think that that person, as a moral matter, is discriminating by that choice to refuse to sell something, it doesn't seem to me that they're going to run afoul of any laws because they're not differentiating between customers on that basis. Those are going to be the kinds of harder cases. Yes?
There seem to be a lot of parallels between the culture wars and challenges around what you're describing here with same-sex marriage as there were 50, 60 years ago around civil rights. Particularly because you mentioned that a lot of the basis for the more conservative voices, they're choosing free speech as their basis as opposed to religious freedom because of the precedent with the Supreme Court. Now, how forgive me, I'm not a student, I'm rusty, but how are these strain of cases pertaining to sexual orientation logically different from the Civil Rights Act that was passed in the 60s? Because to me they look extremely similar, and the only difference that I can see is that in the Bible they're explicit about man and a woman, but again, the conservative voices are not going to be resting their case on religious grounds. So how could it be different?
It's a good question. So the two cases that people on Philip's side often point to, there's the St. Patrick's Day Parade case that they point to, and there's a Boy Scouts case where the Boy Scouts said we don't want to allow gay scoutmasters. That's a private organization. It's subject to public accommodations law, but the court said that they were allowed to refuse. And again, they did it on free speech grounds with the idea that a private membership organization gets to decide what are the criteria for membership as a matter of its free speech and freedom of association. If you reach back to the civil rights era, it seems to me that a much more relevant case than either of the two cases that was just mentioned was the Piggy Park case. Maurice Bessinger of Piggy Park Barbecue was happy to sell takeout to black customers, but did not want them eating in his restaurant. He believed, as a matter of religion, he had Christian beliefs that said that the integration of the races is wrong. God condemns it. He cited the same kinds of verses that Bob Jones University did when they prohibited interracial dating on religious grounds and so on. So he had all kinds of, and he made not just a religious freedom argument, but a freedom of speech argument, saying that by being required to serve people of different races at his lunch counter, that he was being forced to say something he did not want to say, namely that the races belong together. And the Supreme Court completely dismissed that argument, said that's just not going to fly at all. So I agree with you that there are important parallels there. We will see in about a month and a half or so, or 2 months maybe, whether the Supreme Court agrees with us on that.
How about a student question as a final thought?
Way in the back.
I just wondering what you think would get the situation with the Bible case, if it would be different if the man had asked Silva to write like the actual Bible verse instead of his interpretation, because as you said, he kind of like paraphrased it in like offensive way, and just like what I guess like the difference there is to you.
It's an interesting question. In my view, no, it shouldn't make a difference. Because first of all, it was two things that she objected to. One was the verse and one was the image of the two men with the X through it. So, you have a design that she objected to and particular writing that she objected to. And, while I don't want to place too much moral weight on whether there's writing on the cake or not, because, whether a wedding cake says, "Congratulations, Charlie and David," or not, it seems like it's expressing the same thing. I don't want to place too much, but it does seem as a matter of legal line drawing that the refusal to write particular lettering does help us draw a line with whether we're talking about a design or whether we're talking about a use. And I would say that even if it's direct quotation from the ancient Hebrew, and she didn't want to put it on, she has the right to do that. Now, that also means that I have to bite the bullet on some other cases that some people on, quote-unquote, my side don't want to bite. So, for example, there was a case about a year or so ago in the news of a print shop in Kentucky. Hands-On Originals Print Shop was the name of it. But then they made T-shirts and pens and mugs and calendars and like custom printing of various sorts. This was in Lexington, and a group, Lexington Pride, called them up and said, "Hey, we want you to make T-shirts for our Lexington Pride celebration. I wanted to have like a rainbow-colored number 5 because it was the 5th annual Lexington Pride celebration." And the representative on the phone said, "So what is this all about?" And said, "I'm sorry, we're not going to do that." And the customers filed a complaint with the city of Lexington alleging sexual orientation discrimination. Kentucky generally does not prohibit sexual orientation discrimination, but Lexington does. And the commission said that the print shop was in fact liable for sexual orientation discrimination, and then it worked its way up through the courts, and the district court and the Kentucky Court of Appeals said no, this was not discrimination on the basis of the customer's sexual orientation, this was a refusal to create a particular item with a particular message. And I argued publicly in Slate online that the Court of Appeals was right. The reasoning in the case was kind of contorted, but I think that they reached the right result, again, because I think that taking advantage of this design-based, use-based thing, it wasn't like they're saying, "We won't sell you any T-shirts for this particular event." It said, "We will not make this particular design for you." And I think that they should have their right to refuse that, protected just as much as Marjorie Silva in the Bible case, just as much as Jack Phillips if he were to say, "Look, I won't do a cake with 2 men on top." Okay. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking John Corvino.